Imagine, if you will, being trapped in what can only be described as your absolute worst nightmare. Drifting through space in a tiny metal box, deception, anguish, and unimaginable illness all infecting your fellow crew members, your sense of safety, you. All is lost long before you even know you need to be fighting, and yet somehow you manage to crawl your way out of the horror at hand. You're safe. No aliens to chase you through tight spaceship corridors, no androids to suddenly betray your right to be alive, no ancient truths of the universe, no corporate greed, nothing. Just you and an orange cat drifting alone in a shuttle. Only, you aren't safe, because 57 years later, you wake up from stasis. You're pulled from that shuttle that had been your refuge and into a whirlwind of more deception and corporate greed. You recount your horrors to deaf ears. You attempt to hide only to be dragged right back to where it all began, if for no other reason than to prove your point. You're back in the horror of it all, simply because no one would listen to you scream. This is where Ellen Ripley finds herself in the beginning of 1986's Aliens. Lost, afraid, and unheard. I think about this franchise quite often. I've been doing so for years now. The way that each film builds off of the previous, the unimaginably large scope of the entire story spanning from Prometheus to Resurrection. The poster. It is truly chilling, perhaps even one of my favorites of all time. Big, bold letters that alert you to the aforementioned presence of an alien. The dark emptiness surrounding that warns you of the sinister nature. The ominous, glowing egg that piques your interest. And a tiny line written underneath, far too small to be read from afar. And so, you lean in closer, right in near the egg. You read a line and are greeted with dread. In space, no one can hear you scream. Gods, is that not just brilliant marketing? Imagine having seen that. Only then you go and watch the film. You see those eggs you saw in the poster. You see what they do, what's inside of them. And then you think back to that time that you willingly put your face right next to one. It's terrifying. It's brilliant. And then there's that line. In space, no one can hear you scream. I've been thinking about it a lot lately, because it's not the notion that I might scream in space that most rattles me, it's space. And now that you mention it, it's not hard to imagine just how terrifying that might be. I can imagine the isolation alone might be enough to drive me to scream into the endless void, just hoping that something or someone might scream back. But no one can hear me? Who's listening? Or rather, who should be listening? And why? I've been haunted by this notion ever since I rewatched some of the films, and I'm not sure what's more dreadful, the question or the answer. Or perhaps it's the revelation that posters can tell lies. I don't think the space jockey scene needs any introduction. It's iconic, always has been, and I think it's truly one of the most terrifying scenes of the entire film. Because, sure, the film would get much more scary later on, it's way more in your face about it, but really think about that space jockey scene. This is the discovery of new life, massive life. It sits in technology that we couldn't even begin to comprehend. And just by looking at it, we know that the jockey would have been a fearsome foe for us to face. And yet, it is dead. And not just dead, but killed. This grandiose creature, this behemoth of a life form, capable of controlling technology from beyond our wildest imagination, was killed by an alien that we can't yet see or hear. There's a really important line that's quite easy to miss. The space jockey isn't just a corpse. It's been fossilized.
Looks like it's been dead a long time. Fossilized.
And sure, that might just be random movie jargon, because how on earth could this thing have become fossilized from within its own spaceship? But that doesn't take away the dread. The space jockey has to have been dead for at least 10,000 years. 10,000 years it sat there on LV-426, alone, unheard, and no one even thought to look for it. Nobody heard the space jockey scream, but I bet it still did. And if this creature can have sat here unheard for so long, what hope is there for the crew of the Nostromo? Here they stand where this behemoth was once killed. Will they scream the same scream that it did when they meet the same fate as it? And that's not quite where it ends, is it? Because sure, the space jockey would disappear into the early frames of the film, but a later scene would shine an awful black spotlight on that one miserable moment. Are these ears I see? Poised, pricked, open for the sounds of a chilling final scream. These special orders aren't new. No. They're clearly part of an established protocol. But how could they be, if there weren't already ears for the screaming? It would be easy for me to talk about how this moment changes the film's antagonist from being the xenomorph to Weyland-Yutani. But I think we can delve even further into that very notion. Because whilst the Special Order is terrifying enough within the original Alien, the further this franchise expands, the deeper this bubbling cesspool of hyper-capitalistic nightmare seems to sink. Let's go back to the sequel, Aliens, which sees Ripley return to LV-426 after 57 years in stasis. The planet has become a mining colony, and the horrors of Ripley's past appear to have been completely ignored. When she mentions eggs and giant leathery creatures that burst from the chests of infected humans, she is laughed at and mocked. Weyland-Yutani tell Ripley that they don't believe her, that she lost everything, her crew, her sense of safety, her stability. Gods, she even lost her daughter through an impossible passage of time. All for nothing. They don't blame her for their deaths, but at this point, what difference would it make? Alien is going to repeat itself. The ignorance of those around her, and as we learn later, the greed of those in control, is going to resurrect the horror of LV-426. This alone would have been a brilliant premise for a horror film, but James Cameron didn't stop there. Remember what I said about Special Order 937? How it seems to be part of an already established protocol? Well, as we would learn later on in Aliens, Burke, the seemingly helpful Weyland-Yutani employee, ordered the colonists of LV-426 to explore the same location that spawned the horrors of the original Alien. Burke, and by extension, Weyland-Yutani, knew about the xenomorph eggs and actively sought them out at the expense of others. They heard Ripley. They didn't just hear. No, Weyland-Yutani we're listening. But why? Well, let's go back to Ripley's daughter. Isolation takes place 15 years after the events of the original Alien. Ellen Ripley is still lost somewhere in space, and the Nostromo's location is still unknown. Amanda Ripley, Ellen Ripley's aforementioned daughter, has not given up, however. And after learning that the Nostromo's flight recorder has been retrieved at Sevastopol Station, she joins a crew inbound to collect it. The mission goes about as awful as you might expect. A rogue xenomorph has lain waste to the station. Androids are turning on the crew for seemingly no reason. There are double crosses from Weyland-Yutani operatives. There are losses. Isolation plays out pretty much as you might expect the prequel to Aliens to do so. Only, Aliens wouldn't take place for another 42 years. And despite the name, these events aren't isolated either. They're documented. In fact, they're well known by Weyland-Yutani. It was them that sent Amanda after all. So we look to this game, and then we look to Aliens. And suddenly, those early scenes where Ripley deftly screams to Weyland-Yutani suits about xenomorphs and alien eggs, well, they don't seem so helplessly desperate, but completely and utterly numbing. My skin went white when I watched these scenes, and I don't think it would have been as scary if I'd watched them back in '86. But now, with the context of Isolation, and worse yet, Prometheus, I could hardly stop myself from shaking.
Prometheus was punished by the gods for giving the gift of knowledge to man. He was cast into the bowels of the earth and pecked by birds.
This is not a quote from Ridley Scott's 2012 film, Prometheus, nor is it a quote from the film's namesake, Aeschylus's classic tragedy, Prometheus Bound. No. This is a quote spoken by GLaDOS in Portal 2, as she and Shell tumble deep into the past of Aperture Science laboratories.
Hi, editing Saf here. I've made a slight error. That quote isn't from GLaDOS at all. It still applies to everything that I have to say, but that quote is actually from a sentry turret later in the game. Again, everything I have to say about this still stands, but the quote that I'm basing this all off is not actually from GLaDOS. Enjoy the video.
The pair land in the now buried beginnings of Aperture, where former CEO Cave Johnson began his endless escapade of mindless science. This section of the game has always stuck out to me. A fall through a modern Tartarus, followed by an ascent through the ghosts of GLaDOS' past, who, need I remind you, is the villain of the previous game and the early sections of this game. And what do we get for that? A redemption arc? A new understanding of GLaDOS? How she was abused by the people around her and turned into the spiteful, test-hungry machine that she is today? I mean, maybe. We certainly get lots of backstory between Cave Johnson and GLaDOS, who at this point was known as Caroline, and in unused voice lines from the game, we can clearly hear Caroline awfully pained by the idea that she might one day be turned into GLaDOS. She quite clearly says, "Mr. Johnson, I don't want this." So there you have it, right? Caroline is a victim, and GLaDOS may not be as much of a villain as we once thought. Right? Right? Portal 2 goes down a bit of a different route to what we might expect. Rather than redeem GLaDOS as a victim of abuse, we instead explore what it means for GLaDOS to exist now that the aforementioned abuse has made sure that Caroline doesn't. Absolutely, we can acknowledge that GLaDOS became what she did because of the abuse that she and Caroline suffered at the hands of others. But what is equally intriguing here is that GLaDOS doesn't seem to care. She erases Caroline at the end of the game, solidifying that she and her are now different entities entirely. And the game makes it quite clear that she doesn't seem all that intent on changing her ways once the credits roll. Falling into Portal 2's infamous pit of buried knowledge does recontextualize the characters much as one might expect. But that recontextualization does not attempt to change anything about who those characters are. It's just extra bits to chew on as the world burns around you. Prometheus is a lot of things. It was envisioned as being a prequel to Scott's Alien franchise that would expand upon the lore and history of the world. And it does. We learn quite a lot here, even the origins of humankind itself. The film is full of mystery and intrigue, questions and answers. Gods, the answers. You're telling me that 29 years before the Nostromo landed on LV-426, there was another ship with another crew on another planet that found much earlier forms of the xenomorph? And worse yet, it was all conducted by the same company? Forget everything we learn about the engineers, the space jockey, the origins of human life. Forget the existential question posed by humans and androids who have met their own gods. Matter of fact, forget isolation, forget the early scenes of aliens, because none of it matters anymore. Forget everything. Because this is what Prometheus does. Weyland-Yutani encountered the xenomorph nearly 3 decades before the Nostromo. They were familiar with it all. Prometheus reveals to us the secret knowledge of the company. Only, it isn't Weyland-Yutani that are punished for this. It's us. We, the ones gifted Prometheus's knowledge. We're the ones cast into a pit to be pecked at endlessly by birds. Only, those birds take the form of dread, and the pecking, the pain it induces, takes the form of absolute pure misery. They knew. Weyland-Yutani knew exactly what Ripley found on LV-426. They believed every word of what she had to say. No, even worse, they knew before she said it, before she met it. They knew what was on that planet. Maybe not concretely, but they had enough suspicions to send a team to scout it out. Those protocols they had in place, Special Order 937, those protocols were put in place because of the events of Prometheus and Covenant. They knew. They heard her scream. And what does that change? Are the original films now these wholly new experiences with this knowledge at hand? No. Just like in Portal 2, Prometheus recontextualizes the world without even trying to change anything about who these characters are. Weyland-Yutani were always after the xenomorph. The mission to LV-426 was always done so for this reason. But we knew that. This just drives the knife in further, draws more blood, hurts us deeper. Prometheus is not my favorite film in the franchise. That title belongs to Aliens. The gods. It's the film I think about the most. There's also Alien Covenant, a film that expands upon a lot of the existentialism brought up in Prometheus, and I'm sure it brings a lot to the discussion here, but unfortunately, I've not seen it. From what I understand though, it is a film all about the existential questions brought up when you meet your own god and are disappointed by the answer, as well as homoerotic explorations with your clone.
Watch me. I'll do the fingering. Go on.
Which sounds like an absolutely wonderful ride to me. There is another film in this franchise that I would love to talk about, however, and that film is Resurrection could have been exactly that. A nothing film that rebooted the franchise after Ripley's death in 3. I think there's certainly a world where the film did away with Ripley entirely and focused on Winona Ryder's call as the new lead. And whilst I love Winona Ryder, and I'd quite like to see more of Cool in this world, I think that would have been a way weaker film than what we got. Because what we did get was Ripley's cloned rebirth into a world 200 years distant from her own. Just from the opening title sequence, this film makes it very clear that it's something different. Something really different. I made a note whilst watching that it feels like Sigourney Weaver is acting in a different film from everyone else, as though she was given the script to Alien 4, and everyone else was given the script to this new plucky reboot. And oddly enough, I mean that in such a positive way. Ripley is alive again in a world that should have forgotten her. This series, all about corporate greed and civilian isolation/exploitation, that already had an admittedly weak finale, is back. Alive. Resurrected. After 2.5 films criticizing the very notion of overexploiting their characters, we're back. And I think the film knows that. Alien Resurrection is aware. No, in fact, Ripley is aware. So many of Ripley 8's lines feel directed at the audience. After killing her first xenomorph, she crawls out of a hole in the ground and says to Cool,
"Was it everything you hoped for?"
she's making fun of it all. Of the film, of Cool for thinking anything higher of her. She is aware that she is a product both of USM and of 20th Century Fox. It's hard not to think about Portal 2 again here. Not after GLaDOS reawakens for the first time, or after returning from Tartarus to see what Wheatley has done with the place. No. I'm reminded of the end of the game. Shell is alone in a room with GLaDOS, Atlas, and Peabody. This is the kindness that GLaDOS ever is to Shell, and yet the disdain is still there. Though, it doesn't feel directed at Shell. Instead, I think GLaDOS is frustrated with the powers in control. When she tells Shell to leave, it doesn't feel directed at Shell at all, but rather at the player, as though GLaDOS is frustrated with you. Her entire narrative arc has been about realizing she was once a human woman who was forced into this digital world. It's been about GLaDOS waking up. I think in this moment that maybe, if only in a metaphorical sense, GLaDOS realizes that she is part of a video game. She had to relive this, and yet she cannot escape. Her final song, Want You Gone, is not directed at Shell, but the player. Don't come back. Don't play this story again. Please. Don't make me suffer like you already have. Showing us Atlas and Peabody at the end of the game is showing us another way to play. Another story in which GLaDOS does not have to suffer. Resurrection ends with Ripley 8 and Cool, a clone of her dead self and an android created by other androids, looking out over the clouds of Earth as the sun sets. It is such an image. So much of the scenery feels alien. And it's because it is, even to us as the viewers. It's such a significant image because neither of these two women have ever set foot on Earth before. And they are both products of the reason that that is. No matter what direction you travel in this franchise, into the past where Weyland Yutani encountered their first xenomorph and the engineers that created human life, or into the future where United Systems military cloned a dead Ripley to harvest a xenomorph queen, we find corporations listening for when people scream. That is the biggest lie of Alien. In fact, it's the very core of what this franchise is about. In space, your pain, your misery, dread, trauma, your death. It all creates screams. Screams that will be heard by hungry ears. Listening. Always listening. To Weyland-Yutani, we are nothing but instruments in a grand orchestra of opportunity. Perhaps the best thing we can do is stay silent. Oh, and just one more thing. In the non-canon short film, Alien Containment by director Chris Reading, we get exactly this revelation. Not a scream out into the endless void, not a hope that someone might save the already doomed characters. Just silence. And perhaps a hope also. Hope that, should their vessel be found, it is left alone. Forgotten. Do not listen for our screams. And gods, if you are, stop. Please. Towards the end of the short, Gaiawee's ward is injured by a xenomorph, and that same creature is hunting her. In her final moments, she uses her own blood to paint a message on the glass of their escape pod's door. Do not open. But alas, we know the company is listening. We know they heard her scream. And we know that they will open that door. We can only hope that when they scream, it is far more silent than Ward's was.